Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 355. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about colonial cities, Mayan ruins, and language schools as we go to Guatemala.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one, we watched Harry Potter actress Emma Watson grow up, but apparently somebody at the TSA doesn't think she's done growing up. She was mistaken for an unaccompanied minor at JFK Airport recently. She is 22, and an unaccompanied minor would be under the age of 12. And then we often have stories of unruly passengers. We had an odd one this week when a passenger went a little crazy on a flight from Iceland Air to New York City. He ended up choking the person next to him, screaming the plane is going down or something to that effect, and was duct tape to his seat by the other passengers. So if you're not packing duct tape for your next flight, maybe you should think about it. But overall, we had the good news that 2012 worldwide was the safest year in air travel since 1945. Now, I'm assuming they meant the safest in commercial air travel. As I recall, a lot of planes were being shot down in 1945. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Shannon O'Donneal, who's coming to us from alittle.adrift.com and come to talk to us about Guatemala. Shannon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
And Shannon is another one of those people who I've had on This Week in Travel, and we wanted to just find some place that we could talk about that she has knowledge of, because I just wanted to have an excuse to have her on the show. And Guatemala, you've spent some time, and you went there for both volunteer travel and to learn Spanish, was my understanding.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I was going to Central America to travel down through them, and my plan had been to stop in Guatemala to learn Spanish for maybe a few weeks, but it turned out to really resonate with me, and I stayed there for almost 3 months.
Interesting. And what about Guatemala resonated with you? Why Guatemala of all the different countries down there?
Well, it was a fantastic place to learn Spanish, so that's what initially got me there, but the country is incredibly beautiful, and it's not sort of a one-note country. It's got highlands, it's got volcanoes all over the place that really make it photogenic. Antigua, one of the main cities, is surrounded by volcanoes, which makes it very, very pretty to sort of stand at the base of and see that in the distance. And then it has the Mayan culture. So no matter where you're at in the country, and places are quite far apart because it is a big country, but there's something really interesting and unique, and it's different than where you just were. So I spent my time there spending a lot of time in each individual region trying to soak up the different cultures and the feeling of what it was like to be in each different spot.
And you see, it's a good country to learn Spanish in. It's relatively inexpensive, but what else about it made a good... And they speak Spanish. those would be two things I could think of. But what else about Guatemala made it particularly well-suited for that?
Well, it's their tourism industry. They built themselves as a destination for it, which helps because there are a lot of language schools. There are a lot of options. There are also a lot of people trying to learn Spanish. So you have a lot of options. Many people go to Antigua. It has the infrastructure with the Wi-Fi and a lot of tourism there. And they have language schools. And there's the lake area where also people go, and it's very touristy. But for me, it was the north in Shela, where it's the Western Highlands. It's not a very touristy town, and not very many people speak English. And if they do speak English, they know that you're there to seriously learn it. There are language schools there. There are family homestays where you can learn the language. And they know that you're there to be serious about it, more so than just to see the sights, that you really want to learn the language. So I found that at restaurants, the waiters wouldn't automatically switch to English if you started having problems. They were willing to let you figure it out. And that's not the case everywhere. And many times in the tourism industry, they want to get you in and out, or they want to help you by speaking English to you. Right. But in Shela, it's a very language learning culture up there. The city doesn't have a lot of tourism, and those that do come to learn the languages. So I really enjoyed learning language up in the north. And it's called Quetzaltenango, but the nickname, because that's a mouthful, is Shela.
And that is not a Spanish word. That would be a Mayan word, I'm going to guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Anything else we want to say about if you're going to Guatemala to learn a language before we go on to sort of regular tourism?
The language learning is often coupled with volunteering, which is part of what I like to do when I travel. So many of the language schools, especially if you want to volunteer, sometimes that's the best window into volunteering, is going to a language school and connecting with the opportunities they have found. They will pair themselves up with small communities or schools and that sort of thing. And the money that you spend on your Spanish language will often go directly back into the community with many of them. So I think that's a really neat aspect about Guatemala, where not all tourism industry is built around Spanish. I know like there are places in South America where it's also really good to learn Spanish, but that unique kind of blend of social enterprises that really use the tourism to funnel it back into the community is unique to Guatemala in my mind.
Excellent. And we're going to talk a little more about a book that Shannon wrote about voluntourism or volunteer travel later on. But now getting to Guatemala and more as a tourist, what itinerary would you recommend for somebody to see Guatemala?
Part of what I was saying about how different the landscapes are means that some of the routes you take might be different depending on your interests. So if you wanted to do hiking, you would start in Antigua. And I don't recommend anybody stay the night in Guatemala City, because Guatemala, it is dangerous. I use that term because the U.S. warns against it. There is crime, and there are aspects of the country that are more dangerous than other places you could travel. But to that end, beyond having my debit card cloned and money taken from it.
So you fell for an ATM machine that had a false front or something?
Didn't have a false front. I'm told it had organized crime behind it because it was lit. Okay. It was attached to a bank, and it was like blocked in with glass. And anyway.
Okay.
But it wasn't a violent crime. So nothing happened to me, and I spent many months there. But to that end, I would say don't stay in Guatemala City. You go straight to Antigua, and that's the base. And I love Antigua.
And Antigua is the former capital, but the capital moved away because of earthquakes, as I understood.
They do have earthquakes.
I'm from California. That doesn't scare me. So
excellent. Yes. And you feel the tremors, especially if you're there for a bit of time. But that is a really good base. And so then you have to go see Tikal. If you have not ever been to Guatemala, to not go to Tikal, which is a very long ways away, but it's definitely supposed to be on the itinerary because it's the Mayan ruins, the largest complex sort of that has been unearthed. They've excavated a lot of them.
And not just the largest in Guatemala, as I understand, but the largest Mayan ruins.
Yes, absolutely. And they don't even know all of what's under there because as you're walking through the ruins, many of them are still covered in grass and mounds. And there are a couple that you're allowed to hike to the top of. And you look out over dense jungle, and they'll tell you they don't know what's under the dense jungle. They know that this was a really vibrant city. And like any cities, there were probably suburbs or communities that built along the fringes, but they haven't found them. They haven't been able to excavate all of what's there. So it's very, very neat to learn about what they have found. And every year there's new information that other people will learn that I haven't because I was there a bit ago. So
I'm always amazed when I go to places like that. And I think probably the place that I went to that's closest to that in terms of unexcavated is near Oaxaca in Mexico. You go up to the ruins there at the top and they say, yeah, well, there are ruins at the top of all of the hills around here. We just haven't got around to it yet. And so it is interesting that if you go back in 10 years, you may in fact find a different Tikal.
Hmm. And it is fascinating because part of you goes, well, why aren't we all here digging this out? This is fascinating, but there's not enough money, I guess.
Right. Yeah. No, it's mostly a money problem, money and time.
Hmm.
Okay. So we go to Tikal. Anything specific you would recommend for how we see Tikal, where we stay, or how we get there?
Yes, I was not able to do it. I actually had been sick right before I got to Guatemala. I was in Belize and I had fallen ill to something I'm allergic to that I'm not sure. Anyway, so I got to Guatemala, to Tikal in particular, and I stayed in town in Flores and took the sort of day tour in. But if I had it to do over again, and people I've talked to, I would have stayed at Tikal. And they have, I think it's a jungle lodge that you can stay there on the grounds, and that's the only way you can see sunrise at Tikal.
Sure.
And the other tourists haven't arrived by buses.
And they won't get there till 10 or something like that?
Right. So you have the place to yourself. And boy, would I have loved to do that, but I had to stay in town to get medical care.
Okay. And then I assume you got a guide when you went to Tikal, since we're talking about a place so large.
Yes, I got a guide, and that's the easiest way if you're going to stay in Flores. It is a bit of time. It's at least a half an hour on the bus, and if they stop for gas and all that, it adds up. But it is a ways away from Flores. That's the main hub town. But you have to have a guide or some sort of transportation, and they take you around and they show you the different quirks of what they've found, which is much more interesting than just staring at piles of rocks.
Okay. Anything particularly memorable about Tikal? You've been to other ruins, you've been to other historic sites. What stands out from Tikal?
I really liked the howler monkeys. Is that silly to say? There are a lot of howler monkeys that live all over that jungle area. So as you're walking around, the guides will try to provoke them so that you can hear what they sound like. And if you haven't, I suggest you do go, because it's this really deep, like, it's going to embarrass me if I do it, but it's like a really, they make this loud noise that reverberates throughout the jungle. And if you're up on top of one of the ruins, it changes which ones they allow you to climb. If you're up on top, you can just hear it echoing really far away through all the jungles nearby. I think it's very cool.
Excellent. And after we do Tikal, where would we head to next?
So that would depend on, again, your interests. So for me, I really like the Rio Dulce and Livingston. I feel like if you went there next, you would see a completely different side. You've been to Antigua, you've seen sort of the mainstream Spanish culture mixed with the Mayans. There's a lot of Maya textiles, and you can see all of that in Antigua. And then you go up to Tikal and you see the ancient history. And then you go to the river and you go to Livingston, which has the Black Caribbean culture. And what they say is that 2 ships wrecked full of slaves from Nigeria. And so the demographic is completely different. The food is completely different. Really bad for a vegetarian. I'll put that out there because it's very seafood based, unless you're a pescatarian. But it was very neat. The music was different. It was this, I have a hard time saying the word, the Garifuna culture, Garifuna. And they have their own music and they have the Caribbean accent. It was just really neat to be in Guatemala and see something completely different to where I'd just been hours before.
Mm-hmm. And Rio Dulce, Sweet River. Yes,
is beautiful. So the Rio Dulce, you can stay in that city. It's like a couple hours up the river from Livingston, because Livingston is right on the Caribbean. And then Rio Dulce goes up the Rio Dulce River, and you can stay in that town. And that journey is very pretty. You can do it by boat. There are other ways to get to Livingston, but I find that river journey was gorgeous. It had water lilies and children in boats and little houses and huts along the way. So it was quite interesting. And then from Rio Dulce, you can go to anywhere else in the country via shuttle bus or not so much chicken buses, shuttle buses. Chicken buses go, but that's not the way that tourists would normally get to Rio Dulce because it's quite far.
And we say chicken bus, so we're talking about in Latin America there being first-class buses and second-class buses, and you're talking about the second-class bus.
Yes.
Or a third if there is one.
Right? We could go pretty low with those. So, yeah, the chicken buses are the American school buses. That's what we would call them.
Mm-hmm.
But they are wacky, wild colors, and they normally have sayings that have to do with Christ, the Savior, and all of these religious sayings on them. And they're very cool. They're sort of like tricked out, as we would say, just hanging things and fur from the rearview mirrors. It's just very interesting to see. I recommend everybody go on one, even if you don't use it as your main mode of transportation.
And if we were to hop on one in there, and where would you go next?
From Rio Dulce.
Yep.
Back to Antigua. That's the hub. And for me, that was sort of where everything based out of. And it's the easiest city. So some of the travel days can get really long because the distances are very far. So if you don't fly from, say, Tikal to Antigua, if you take the buses, you get very tired. So I feel like Antigua is the best place to sort of regroup, to eat really good food, to wander a small city that's very walkable. You don't have to get a cab or some sort of local transport anywhere. You just walk, and there's lots of restaurants, lots of Wi-Fi. It's very easy.
Before we leave Antigua, we haven't really spent any time in Antigua just yet. So what would you do in Antigua? Any particular restaurants you would go to? Any particular sites that you would see? Where would you stay?
I stayed in hostels. I had private rooms in hostels, but that was my go-to throughout Guatemala. But they have hotels. And if I had to do it again, I probably would still stay in private rooms and hostels just because I really like, as a solo traveler, I like having other people, instant friends to sort of do things with. But there are many, many hotels of every budget in the city. And so I stayed at Yellow House, Casa Amarillo in Antigua, and it was great. They had many private rooms and they had a big breakfast buffet. And I found friends to do sort of the other things that you do in the city, which is the day trips. You can see Pacaya, which I'm a little bit of a chicken. So I went to the volcano and I saw the live lava, but I was terrified.
When you say you saw the live lava, are you standing by the live lava? Are you seeing the live lava in a distance?
Oh, you're standing next to it. Whereas, like, if you're a klutz, you fall in and you could burn skin off yourself. I mean, it's not like the U.S. We don't have barriers. There's not a little bridge that you walk up really nice steps to. You walk up the dry lava, these black, kind of tripping, and it's very hot. They tell you have to wear pants. The people who ignored that had heat burns. It looked like a sunburn from the heat coming up from underneath the rocks because there is lava under there. And you can see it in the distance, and sometimes there's more lava and less lava, but you can definitely get within a few feet of it if you can stand the heat and take a picture of yourself. You can roast marshmallows. They'll sell marshmallows to you to sort of roast.
Actually, the only place in the U.S. I know you can do that on the big island of Hawaii at the Pu'u'o event, there are also no railings because, for one thing, the lava's at a different place every day. But there are at least rangers there saying, no, don't put a stick in the lava. That would be stupid. Because they've seen people accidentally flick hot lava at their friends, not meaning to. So that is something that should be avoided.
Yes.
I think it's 1,500 degrees or something ridiculous like that. I mean, it's melted rock, so.
It was hot. I was amazed where there was no lava just everywhere. There's just so much heat coming out of the ground. It was neat. But again, you could hear the rocks sort of going in the distance from the volcano. And at night, if you were allowed up Pacaya at night, I guess it's molten. You can see the rocks glowing as they eject from it. So it's interesting. People think it's very cool. I thought it was very cool. The bottom of my friend's shoes, she chose to wear really cheap sneakers. I had on my hiking boots, which have a permanent scar on them where I sort of stepped into a crack that was very hot and it melted the side of my sneakers. Her sneakers completely melted. You could see her socks by the time she got down to the bottom.
Oh my gosh. That would seem undesirable because she was moments away from a burn then, basically.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's neat.
Spectacular, beautiful, and terrifying.
All of those things, exactly, Chris. So that's really popular. Everyone does it. I sort of was like a lemming and went and did it. And I'm glad I did. It was very cool, but it, like we said, terrifying. So other than the volcano, there are little day tours you can do if you like the agricultural aspects. So there are coffee farms. I found a macadamia nut farm that I thought was neat. There's not really tours. It's run by an expat couple who give back a lot. They give macadamia nut trees to the locals to help them have an industry of their own. So even though they export the macadamia nut oil, it's very sort of social enterprising. Okay. And they take volunteers, but I didn't do that. I just went and had sort of the best macadamia nut pancakes I've ever had in my life. They used macadamia nut flour and macadamia nut butter, and it's about 20 minutes on a local bus outside of town, and on their website they tell you how to get there. And you can have breakfast there underneath the trees, and I thought that was really neat and not something anyone else I've talked to has done. And it's in the guidebook, sort of like really small. Last time I looked at the guidebook, and it doesn't say to actually do it. It's sort of like, well, if you want to, you could. I thought it was a very cool way to have breakfast outside of the city.
And which guidebook were you using?
Lonely Planet.
Okay. In that part of the world, it seemed like a given, but I thought I would ask. Anything else that the Lonely Planet suggested that you would pass up?
It's tough because I know friends recommend Chichicastenango, but I didn't really love it. It was a market that you can go to, and they do day trips, especially. I did it from like Atitlan. I did a day trip where you go on Thursday or Sunday to the market. And it's a huge market. And there are many, many, many people who come from all the surrounding communities. So it's not necessarily overly touristy, although tour buses arrive by the hordes with people. But unless you're in the shopping for like massive amounts of Guatemalan textiles where you want to get a good deal and you want a huge selection, I would stay closer to town and maybe spend that day that you are doing this day trip up into Chichicastenango, recoup, and then go to one of the other areas like the river or Shayla or something like that.
Okay. Oh, actually, before we leave Antigua, I understand they're also known for their cathedral.
Oh, yes. It is beautiful, especially at night. If you walk around Antigua, that's also really neat. So if you walk around during the day, all of your pictures have one of the 3 volcanoes in the background. And then if you walk around at night, it's completely different feel. They have the churches lit up, this sort of Spanish colonial architecture. It's a very, very pretty city with bright painted colors, and the churches are bright yellow with white trim and very gorgeous. It's a very Catholic country.
Sure.
So you have a lot of that influence there.
And then you started to go someplace else.
I have no idea. Well, those are my highlights for me.
Okay.
Shayla was, and I didn't talk about Shayla. Not many people go there. It's a very unattractive city.
Okay.
Especially if you just come from Antigua, which is gorgeous. Shayla is not very pretty. It's colder, so that takes, for some people, me, some of the enjoyment out of it. I don't like being cold, but it's where the language schools are. It's where you can find a lot of culture. And if you like trekking, I hadn't mentioned that, there are trekking places that you can go into the mountains, and it's very different than other regions. You can do some really good hikes and see some communities that way.
And we're back in the north, in the mountainous part of the country.
Yeah, the Western Highlands, so like the
Western
north.
Highlands, okay.
Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's much colder, is because you can't get much lower than, cold.
So Guatemala changed your plans. What about Guatemala surprised you?
How multicultural it was. I expected it to just not be as interesting as it was, that I could go to one area and feel like I had seen most of it. And that wasn't the case at all. I started in Tikal and then went to Antigua, and every time I went there was something else new. There was a new aspect of the culture I hadn't seen, and then especially when I went to Livingston and I found that entirely different culture and music, I went, this place is really neat. I feel like I need to stay. And I left. I went to Honduras because I wanted to go diving, and I cut my time short in Honduras even, and I came back to Guatemala for my last week. I crossed over the border and spent some time back in Guatemala because I had missed it. It's just a really neat country.
Any of the locals who left an impression on you?
My teachers in the north. I lost my debit card the day I arrived in Shayla. I got money out, and I couldn't pay. So I didn't pay for my lodging. Everybody there, they trusted in a way that is very rare, especially with Westerners. I mean, for me to go to a hotel and say, I don't have any money, can I stay here anyway? Which is what I did. I hadn't paid yet. I had checked in, and then I went to the ATM. That was my downfall. And I took out just enough money for like a few different things, but I didn't take out enough to pay for my language school or my hotel. I had to go to them, and I had to go to my language school, and I had to go to all of these people and say, I don't have money, but I promise when I do, I will pay you. And they took that on faith. All of them. I mean, I lived for a week and a half without my debit card while it was in transit from the U.S. And everybody made sure that I had what I needed, that I wasn't starving to death. And that stood out for me because I can't say that would have happened everywhere. It hasn't had to happen anywhere else, but there have been times in Laos where I was very sick and nobody would help me because it didn't seem like as a Westerner I should need it. Maybe. I'm not sure what happened there, but there were places where people weren't as kind as I found them in Guatemala.
Excellent. Best day you had, whole country.
I went and built stoves outside of Shayla for the day. It was just a day thing. They bank on the fact that more tourists will come behind me and keep the project going. And again, it's paid for with language learners money. And so I went, and it was very neat because you're there helping somebody. It was this young family. They had a tiny baby, and we were building them a stove outside of their house versus the cook fires that they use that fill their whole houses with smoke, and children burn themselves and all of that. But beyond that, after we sat down with this family, and there were several houses where we were working at the same time, and they all got together and they brought us out tamales and all of this food that I don't eat because I'm vegetarian. But it was very humble, and they tried so hard to extend as much as they could to us. And it was just really interesting to sit down with them. And I ate a lot of the corn tamales and tried to pick around the other food. But beyond that, it could have been a negative, it could have been tough, but they were so warm and welcoming that I just felt like the whole day had been a positive because they were really appreciative, and they sat down and they talked to us as best we could communicate because not all of us spoke Spanish incredibly well at that point. My Spanish is decent, but it was just all around really neat. We got to walk around all the different communities, and children came and said hello, and it was a beautiful region. And in general, I just enjoyed how normal the day seemed. I could just see a window into these lives, and nothing spectacular or amazing happened. But I went pretty far outside the city and just got to see a slice of life that you don't normally see.
Excellent. You talked about it being beautiful. Imagine now you're standing at the most beautiful spot you were in all of Guatemala. Where are you standing, and what are you looking at?
I'm standing at Smoke Champagne, which I did not mention.
Ah, okay.
And it's beautiful. And I didn't mention it because for the average person traveling, it's one spot and it's not close to anything else.
And I don't know what it is.
Oh, you don't. It's waterfalls. It's a series of stepped lakes and waterfalls that are stunningly pretty. And you can hike up above them and look down. And they're sort of like greenish turquoise pools of water that go on for a very long span. And there's forests surrounding them. So they look like this little turquoise paradise right in the middle of the forest. And it's very, very, very pretty.
But you're saying if you were going through Guatemala for a week, you wouldn't have time to get there, and because it's just not near anything else.
Yes. If you're there for a week, even too, the fact is you have to travel quite a bit to get there. And then that's all. The town doesn't have anything to really commend it. There were some caves nearby if you like that sort of thing. But other than that, it's sort of like you go, you see it, and then you leave. But you have a day of travel on either side.
There are some caves nearby if you like that sort of thing. Doesn't sound like you do.
I did the caves.
You did the volcano too, but...
The caves don't terrify me, but they don't interest me as much. There were really cool formations, stalactites, stalagmites. We all have our interests. That's not one of mine.
Okay. That's entirely appropriate. Everybody has different interests. And I often get emails from people who say, I can't believe you talked to so-and-so, they were in this country and they didn't do this. It's like, well, we have different interests. And everybody I bring on, whether they're professional, whether they're amateur, whether they're it's first trip or their 1,000th trip, everybody has a point of view. And that's true of everything you read online. It's true of everything you read in a magazine. It's just we don't always remember that. So, okay.
Exactly.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Guatemala.
The chicken bus conversations. So not as many tourists take the chicken buses as you would expect because they're pretty cool. But there are shuttle buses that take tourists around, and they're fairly cheap. So that's what most people do. Because you go from point A to point B with no stops in between. But I took the local transportation, and the number of just random conversations, people would see me as they boarded the bus and then beeline right for the back of the bus to talk to me. And I was lucky in that I had enough Spanish to communicate on a pretty good level. Like we could hold on some conversations and the questions, and some people came on intoxicated, and those questions.
Yeah. You may not want to share those questions is what you're saying.
Right. I don't have to get into what they were asking, but let's just say they knew they had a Westerner for a very long period of time. They knew that I was probably going a long distance to the next major city. So they used that as a way to interrogate me.
Well, and for those of you who are just getting this as an audio show, you may not know that Shannon is, and I will have to say as a friend, a tall, beautiful redhead. So she's going to stand out a little bit in Guatemala. So I could imagine that you attracted some attention.
Oh, thank you. I did. I did.
One thing you wish you had known before you'd come to the country?
I guess I wish I had known that I was going to enjoy it, that it was going to be this one spot to go, a destination to not sort of include others. Because many people see it as a gateway to sort of hop to a bunch of different countries in the region. Oh, I'm going to do Guatemala and Belize and Honduras and maybe jump down south. And that had been my plan. So I sort of felt all this time like maybe I should keep going. Maybe I should not spend so many weeks and weeks and weeks here. But I think the plan worked out well to just stay there. I really enjoyed my time. I have a really positive opinion of Central America. And there was guilt at the time that I wasn't seeing Nicaragua and Costa Rica and Panama and continuing on to other countries. And I plan to go back to Guatemala. And there's no guilt there either. I may not go to Nicaragua anytime soon, even though people tell me I will like it. But for me, Guatemala really held a place, a special place.
Well, and I think that leads into my next question is, when did you feel closest to home? When was this place just so familiar? And when was it the furthest from home? When was it completely different?
Closest to home, I'll take that to mean comfortable. So I was the most comfortable when I was hanging out and giving myself time to relax in Antigua. There were many other expats and people that I could talk to. And sometimes after I had been in full Spanish immersion, I really enjoyed having a city I could go to where I knew I could have a conversation in English with other people my age. And so for me, I used Antigua as a hub in that way. I went back there several times throughout the course of the months, and I would spend a week or two at a time there before I sort of recalibrated and moved on. But I enjoyed using it as a base city because it had enough conveniences that I felt comfortable there as a Westerner. I had things that I felt like I needed, Wi-Fi, Western foods. But then I could go out and enjoy other aspects of the culture without getting overwhelmed. Okay. And then furthest from home, when I lost my debit card, I was probably the most out of sorts. I wasn't sure before people extended the kindness. I had a major freak out session.
Well, you hadn't been in the country that long then either.
Actually, I'd been in there a while because I did my Spanish language class about 3 weeks in. Okay. I went to Paul, I went to Antigua, and I went to the lake. Now, I thought of doing language at the lake, but once I got to the lake, it was very pretty, but the vibe wasn't, well, there were so many Westerners that I felt like I couldn't actually make my Spanish progress very well.
You would be tempted to speak English all your other hours.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why I went up north. And then, yes, that first day I was in Sheila is when I lost my debit card, the very first day. And I was overwhelmed. And my teacher at the language learning school, when I went to him, he really tries not to speak English at all. He pretends he doesn't know it. He does. But I had to explain my situation to him, and I was overwhelmed, and I'm prone to tears when I'm really overwhelmed. So I was just so frustrated trying to communicate that I was not a bad person and I was going to pay him, and I understood if he didn't want me to take Spanish language lessons. And I'm trying to communicate this. You can't express yourself the same way in a second language if you're not fluent in it. So I was really frustrated, and I hated everything that was going on, and I felt like a bad person. Like I just said, I'm not a bad person, but how do I make this person in another language understand it? Because he would not allow me to speak English. Every time I tried to explain my situation in English, he sort of did the glazed over look. And it wasn't until the end that he admitted that he did speak English and had understood me when I would get frustrated and go, I just wish you could understand what I'm trying to say. But
before we get to our last two questions, one last thought you would leave people with before they go to Guatemala.
Give yourself time to enjoy each place. I mentioned a lot of places, and not everybody will have the time to enjoy even half of them. So for me, slow and giving yourself time to look around and spend an extra day in a city you think might only have one thing interesting to do. But I find the most interesting conversations come from eating lunch in the park. You might not have time to do that if you have a lot of things to check off your list and you're leaving the next day, but staying the extra day in each place and trying to come into natural conversations with people. That would be my main especially if you speak Spanish, because many of them won't speak English. So if you speak Spanish, give yourself time to fall into these natural conversations.
If I said I only had a week, clearly I've got to do less than you did, where would you focus?
Tikal, you have to do Tikal. And Antigua in 1 week, and then maybe the Rio Dulce. Okay. I would go down to Livingston. They have food there, a soup that I can't eat, but people say is amazing.
Excellent.
I would say try that.
Last 2 questions. Finish this thought for me. You really know you're in Guatemala when what?
When you are surrounded by women wearing these incredibly bright traditional clothes, and there's the smell of fried pupusas and plantains surrounding you, and people are hawking fruit from baskets held on the top of their heads. That, for me, speaks to Guatemala.
And I'm not sure that everybody knows pupusas, but we're talking about something that's kind of like a small street taco.
Yes.
Okay.
Stuffed with cheese, sort of dough with cheese.
Oh, stuffed. Well, that's different than the ones I've had from San Salvador. So, okay.
Yeah, they're little rounds of dough.
Oh, okay. Glad I asked then. And if you had to summarize Guatemala in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Multicultural.
Okay.
Beautiful and humble.
And what do you mean by the 3rd one?
The country doesn't promote itself, I feel, as this amazing destination, but they have aspects of something that would appeal to most any traveler. They've got the hiking, they've got the beautiful lakes and the river that you can relax on, and they have a really warm culture of friendly people. And they don't brag about it, but the people you can just enjoy. It's a quiet sort of tourism industry, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Actually, we talked about the lakes. I don't know if we put a name on them.
Lake Atitlan.
Okay.
And it's surrounded by 5 towns, I believe. And the guidebooks sort of tell you the feeling of each town. One is more backpackery, another sort of a gateway to other areas. And then there are some that have resorts and much nicer hotels that are very quiet that you can stay on. And there are volcanoes around it that you can hike up to for sunrise and that sort of thing.
Excellent. And Shannon, where can people read more about your travels?
So I blog at alittleadrift.com. And I have a secondary site, Grassroots Volunteering. I've talked a lot about grassroots volunteering, and it ties in with my book that you mentioned earlier, the Volunteer Traveler's Handbook. So those are my 3 main projects on the internet right now. The travel site, the volunteering site, where you can sort of find community-sourced recommendations for things like language learning companies that have a social enterprising aspect or volunteering opportunities, and then the book.
Excellent. Shannon, thank you so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Guatemala.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris, for having me.
In news of the community, one of the comments I got on last week's episode on Myanmar was from Michael Sanchina, who's been a guest in the show. I really enjoyed this podcast. I appreciate the honest and realistic views on traveling this diverse country. I can't bring myself to visit yet, since waves of tourists I think are going to do more damage than good in the short term. Let's hope the new Myanmar benefits from tourism and not suffers. I would love one day to go on the adventure Dustin talks about with such love. Thanks for sharing. I already have images of gold-tipped pagodas dancing in my head. I also had a comment on an older episode, 333, Travel to the Island of Java in Indonesia. Thanks for giving a positive comment for Java Island. As an Indonesian girl, I'm proud of my country. Java is a beautiful place to see. After the beauty of the volcanoes, we should have an amazing underwater view such as Karimun Jawa. Besides Jawa, we have many islands waiting for you all to explore, such as Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, and Irian Jaya. The best place in Indonesia is Raja Ampat Island, Papua, Irian Jaya. Recommend for you guys. And then we won't be having an episode next week because I will be in Japan. As you may remember, I'm a guest of All Nippon Airways, ANA, who is opening up a route from San Jose to Tokyo. And the first plane landed today from Tokyo and took off again. And I was at a ceremony for it with the mayor and the Secretary of Transportation, Norm Mineta, after whom San Jose Airport is named, and the ambassador to Japan, as well as many people from ANA. And then tomorrow I get on a plane and I get to go to Japan for the first time. So I'm looking forward to that. and we'll talk more about it when I get back. With that, we'll wrap up this show. If you have any comments, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment like Michael did. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.